Muskan, were you able to read the judgment yesterday?
Sir, regarding the Divya pharmacy,
Hmm.
yes, sir, I read it and about as you told us, and when I after you told when you told us, and then I read it, so I was able to understand it regarding
Hmm.
the um, interpretation of section 2 and the about the biodiversity, national and state. So
Hmm.
I was able to understand it, sir.
What were you able to understand? Please share with us.
Sir, the relation between the jurisprudence and the judicial review,
Hmm.
and in the particular case, it was about the section 2, the word unless, and the sharing of the powers in between national and state biodiversity.
Hmm. Okay.
So, yes.
So, can since all of you were expected to read this case, can any one of you, and you can raise your hand if you can, if you would want to answer this. Tell me any specific international treaty or agreement that Divya Pharmacy's judgment has relied on. Yes, Sukriti?
So the Rio de Janeiro 1992 Convention or Declaration, I guess, and the Nagoya Protocol.
Very good. So the reason I asked you this question was so that if you remember the specifics of a particular judgment and it is reflected in your answer, it will create a good impression on your evaluator that yes, this is someone who's actually gone through the bare text of a judgment of a particular judgment. So very good, Sukriti. Good and good, Muskan. Okay. So was there any specific exercise I had given you yesterday? Anybody, or should we continue with the definitions where we were? Yes, Soumya? Yes,
So
Soumya?
you need to read about Justice Kelly and Justice
Oh,
Scalia.
yes. Hmm, hmm,
So
hmm,
may I?
hmm. In what context I had given you this exercise, if you can tell me?
So we were talking about jurisprudence and how two different judges have different approaches towards the law. I think it was about that.
Hmm. So, yes, we were discussing jurisprudence and ethics, right? That is what we were discussing when we had a very good discussion yesterday on how ethics are essentially a bundle of moral principles. I was sharing with you how ethics are different, how ethics is different from tradition. And in that context, I had requested Soumya to read us about two judges of the US Supreme Court. Now, before Soumya goes ahead and takes the floor and tells us about these two judges, which I'm sure she would have read something about them, let me explain to you the structure of the US Supreme Court. So, the US Supreme Court is largely a Supreme Court which sits in full to decide references and cases before it. So, for example, there is an interesting study here in India that if our courts did not provide for intra court appeals, in that situation, there would be less pendency. As you know, in the high courts, in most civil matters, if there is a judgment in a service matter or in a writ petition, miscellaneous writ petition, civil writ petition, then there is a provision for a special appeal from the judgment of the learned single judge to a division bench of the learned high court, and then the division bench of the learned high court can further go ahead and and constitute what is called a full bench or a three judge bench. Say in our high court, in the Uttarakhand High Court, our three judge bench is called a full bench. In say the Andhra Pradesh High Court, a five judge bench is called a full bench. In the Supreme Court, a five judge bench is called the Constitution Bench. And I'm sure you would be hearing about these cases where judges make sit and decide whether the matter should be referred to a larger bench. Can any one of you give me an example of one such case where a matter was referred to a larger bench on one particular issue in the Supreme Court?
Sabrimala, I guess.
Yes, good. Another example, if anyone can give me. It was very controversial.
So
What that took place.
recently, the Supreme Court referred to the matter to a larger bench while they were deciding to question the relating to the ordinance that is no, not the ordinance, the putting up of banners of the anti-CA protesters in Lucknow all over the town and their
Okay.
details.
But the answer I was looking for was the land acquisition case. I don't know if you've heard about it, about
Some Manohar Lal versus Indore Development Authority
is
case.
also involved, and Justice, what is his name? Arun Mishra. Arun Mishra's role
Yes.
in presiding over a particular three-judge bench, and then also presiding over the particular bench, which is going the larger bench, which is hearing the reference, which heard the reference, in fact. Okay. So the reason I was giving you all these examples was to explain to you that in India we have this system, but in the US, the full court sits together. So there are 9 judges will sit together and hear the matter, and all of them will hand over judgment, right? So it's both a good thing and a bad thing. So the process is slow, but the process is steady, sure, and final. And there is a lot of interesting jurisprudence involved, and there are clear categories of judges in the US Supreme Court. So and I am sure you would know that judges are also running for office in the United States. It's very different. They don't have a collegium system as we have here in India. They have to testify before the Senate. There is an entire procedure to become a judge of the US Supreme Court. The reason I brought in this example of the US Supreme Court, and now I will ask Soumya to go ahead and explain about the 2 judges, was so that you understand that there are clear categories of judges in the US Supreme Court. You can categorize them as, these are liberal set of judges, these are conservative set of judges, and then we call what some judges swing judges. So they swing from one side to the other. Okay. So Soumya, what have you read about the 2 judges?
Okay, so firstly, talking about Justice Kennedy, he was considered as the swing vote on key rulings because he does not have a specific approach. Like we cannot categorize him that he follows the idea of originalism or textualism because
can anybody tell me, has everybody understood what is a swing vote? What do we mean by a swing judge?
Yes, so
You can, Soumya, but has everyone understood? Would any one of you want me to explain what is a swing vote, what is a swing judge? Just raise your hand. If anybody wants me to explain what is a swing vote, what is a swing judge, all of you have understood? Anybody wants me to explain?
Yes, sir, please explain.
Okay. What happens, as I told you in the US Supreme Court, is that there are clear category of judges. So say there are 9 judges sitting. You know these are 3 conservative judges. You know these are 3 liberal judges. And you know these are 3 swing judges. They can swing. They can go here, they can go there. So they are not from one particular school of thought. So for example, if the Republican Party is in power in the United States, you expect conservatism to grow, conservative judges to grow. If the Democrat Party is in power, you expect liberal judges to grow in the US Supreme Court, their numbers to grow, because they are, in their countries, the political system is very intertwined into judiciary. I give you that example so that if you write this in your answers, for example, you're asked a question on jurisprudence and ethics, you give an example of the American Supreme Court and these 2 judges, which we are going to hear about. It can really tell the evaluator you are someone who's aware about how the judiciary and the justice system functions world over. So a swing judge is one जो किसी particular धड़े का नहीं होता, वो किसी भी तरफ जा सकता है. Is it understood now, Simran?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Yes, Soumya, please go ahead.
Justice Kennedy is known to have been favoring liberty, particularly personal liberty, and for limiting the federal powers. We'll take up some examples of his major landmark rulings. In 1996, he gave the first major gay rights decisions for protection of LGBT Americans from discrimination. And in 2015, he gave his landmark opinion in which he gave the LGBT citizens the right to marry, in which he said that they ask for equal dignity in the eyes of law and the court grants them the right.
Can you tell us the name of the
Uh,
case law?
Obergefell versus Hodges.
Hmm. Can you spell it out for everyone?
Yes. Obergefell versus Hodges.
Okay,
Shall
thank you.
okay. Uh, Also, sir, his view on solitary confinement was that it is an ongoing injustice of great proportions.
Hmm.
Now, if we are to put up his approach towards law in particularly 2 points, we'll say firstly, he has a relatively conservative approach to federal powers that restricted the ability of the Congress to pursue civil rights legislations. Secondly, he has a relatively progressive approach towards the social issues, as we see that he has been promoting LGBT rights, and he also gave a judgment in favor of abortion rights in the US. And yes, so that's pretty much about Kennedy. Now, should I come to
Okay.
Scalia, and then I'll tell the difference between.
Okay, so everybody followed from what Soumya has said. So here is a judge we are discussing. We are discussing this in the context of the interrelationship between jurisprudence and ethics, right? Ethics are a bundle of moral principles. But in a country which is a democracy, in a country whose constitution is very short, the US constitution is not even probably 1/20th the size of the Indian constitution. The US constitution is much older than the Indian constitution, and yet the US constitution has not seen half as many amendments, or in fact even half is very much. They haven't seen even probably 1/3 as many amendments as we have seen in the Indian constitution. So what happens in such a constitution? There is a need for the judiciary to use jurisprudence. Can you hear me, everybody?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
It just notified me that you have been signed out. Just a second. Okay, you can hear me, then it should be fine. Okay. So there is, what was I discussing? I was discussing Kennedy, and I was telling you that no. I was discussing jurisprudence and ethics. Yes, and in that context, I was trying to tell you that in the US Supreme Court, with a written constitution which is very short, where amendments are very difficult to make, therefore the attitude of judges, the leanings of judges, or what can we say, the ethics of judges. You remember Gray's definition, which put a lot of emphasis on judges, right? So that becomes very important. So we heard about Kennedy. We heard about this one case law that you have for reference about what kind of a person Justice Kennedy has been. Now, and I am sure some of you might know, in the US, you continue to be a Supreme Court judge till you drop down dead. There is no retirement age. So therefore, anybody who gets nominated to the Supreme Court, it's taken to be a very important decision by a ruling government. And unlike in India, where you ask the common man and hardly, probably 95% of them would not be able to tell you the name of the Chief Justice of India, in the United States, it's a very sought after issue, and everybody is very interested to know the color and complexion of the Chief Justice and of the other judges of the US Supreme Court, and which way the court is going to lean. So we heard about Kennedy, and now Soumya is going to tell us about Scalia. Please go ahead.
Justice Scalia is referred to as the anchor of court's conservative majority. Reason being that he believes that the constitution should be interpreted in terms of what it theoretically means for those who had drafted it or ratified it over 2 centuries ago. He basically believes in the idea of originalism and textualism. He believes that the only freedoms that should be granted uh, are the ones which are protected under the constitution, as those as those have been coming with us throughout the history. For example, we take up the right to abortion. He says that it's not a constitutional right because the history does not talk about it. Also, it is nowhere mentioned in the constitution that you have a right to abortion. His take on his take on death penalty is that it is constitutional even if it is for minors. So he believes in the idea of death penalty regardless of what the age of the accused was at the time of the incident that took place. Also, he rejects the notion that it is his role to read the constitution or the law and give his own views into the court. In this major case of gay rights, he criticized Justice Kennedy for supporting the gay rights, and he said that the American citizens who do not found homosexuals to be moral should not be imposed to have tolerate such people in the society near their children or at their workplace. That was his interpretation. So that's it.
So let me tell you something I can share with you after reading a lot of these judgments in which Scalia and Kennedy used to be at each other's throat, and they used to give very contrary opinions, as you can see from their leanings. Justice Scalia, say on this particular issue that Soumya referred to on homosexuality, always used to ask this question, that does our constitution give any citizen the right to sodomy? Does the constitution give any citizen the right to have a particular kind of a leaning of homosexual overtones? And Justice Kennedy always said that we have to widen the ambit of the term equality. We have to read all these categories into it. So here is a classic example before you of Kennedy and Scalia to explain to you how big a role does ethics play in its interrelationship with jurisprudence, and how it can be something you can refer to in your answers. Justice Scalia, I think, is no more. He passed away either last year or last to last year. And Justice Kennedy, I think, is still there. So this is somewhat about them. You can use it in your answers. This was just for your knowledge in that context. Thank you, Soumya. You did a very good job. Thank you. So we go ahead with where we were yesterday. We were discussing natural law, and we had discussed Cicero's definition.
So,
Yes. Please go ahead.
so sorry to interrupt. So basically इसमें एथिक्स का रोल कम मुझे दिखाई दे रहा है, जिसमें बल्कि इसमें मॉरल्स ज्यादा दिखाई दे रहे हैं इंडिविजुअल के टू अप्रोच ऑन सब्जेक्ट. सो हाउ you said that ethics is a code of morals which society apply in themselves and making some ruling together. But here the individualism are seen, not a ethic or not a part of a society. Here the individual is making the decision and that is implementing to the larger society. So how you are deriving that thing to the ethics, and how can you say that ethics plays here the important role, rather the individualism is more emphasized in this both the judgments and both contradictory views? I'm still confused on that.
Okay, very interesting issue. Somebody else was also saying something.
So actually, I was saying that we can also see jurisprudence in ethics in the context of George Stingley case. Who was executed in the age of 14.
Yes. Several cases, Roe v. Wade, gun laws, उनका बहुत ये clearly निकल कर आता है. Very good, Jury. You can use it in your answers. आप करना भी use. But issue, going back to your question, see, what I had discussed with you yesterday about ethics was that ethics are not per se limited only to tradition. Ethics are a code or a bunch of moral principles. If you look at the dictionary meaning of ethics, this is largely you will find on these lines. ethics are a code of moral principles. Now, while you say that they are two individuals and how individual liberty is or individual choice and individual decision making is determining jurisprudence, please understand that these individuals are coming from some kinds of school of thoughts. There is a liberal school of thought and there is a conservative school of thought, and both exist in every society, and both play an important role in every society. So when we talk about, or when Soumya shares with you the contrast between Kennedy and Scalia, it is in this context of these two schools of thought, the ethics of these schools of thought manifesting itself through individuals who then become torchbearers or champions of that school of thought. So please understand, they are not just two individuals walking on the street and you pick one and I pick one. These are two individuals of immense legal scholarship who have gone through a very rigorous process in a country as advanced and as developed as the United States, testified before the Senate. So in terms of academic accomplishments, they are very fine gentlemen. They both are competent enough to hold a post in the US Supreme Court. But they, in their writings, in their judicial decision making, in the discharge of their judicial function, are reflecting two schools of thought, which in turn is reflecting two kinds of ethics at play: conservatism and liberalism. So this is why I was trying to give you this example in the context of jurisprudence and ethics, and how ethics can play a role. Of course, it is also a question of individual choices. I agree with you there. These two individuals made some choices and they are trying to stick to it. But it is also a question of the conditioning of two individuals and the schools of thought that are under play, right? So when we talk about politics in general, we refer to right and left, right? This war between right and left. And when we talk about political parties in India or anywhere, we say, oh, this is the right of center party, this is the right wing, this is the left of center party, this is the left wing. So of course we know the names of the parties, we know the politicians' names also, and they are the ones who are driving everything. But these are forces beyond individuals, beyond their names. They are two ideologies, through spectrums of the same of different ideologies that have existed and will continue to exist even beyond them. So 100 years from now, we will have a new name for liberalism and conservatism. It will continue to exist as long as reasoned human existence is going to dominate the face of the earth. So it was in this context. Is the context clearer now, Ishu?
Yes, sir. Thank you.
No problem. Good that you asked. Any further questions? Anybody wants to ask something on Kennedy, Scalia? Anybody who wants to ask why it is relevant also? How can one use it? Anybody?
सर एक बार एक्सप्लेन कर दीजिए.
ये है कि हमने कल पढ़ा था जूरिस्प्रूडेंस एंड एथिक्स, राइट? हमने पढ़ा था कि जूरिस्प्रूडेंस एंड एथिक्स का क्या रोल हो सकता है. तो हम ये कह रहे थे कि एथिकल प्रिंसिपल्स भी लॉ को अंडरस्टैंड करने में, जूरिस्प्रूडेंस क्या है? इट इज द डीपर मीनिंग ऑफ द लॉ. उसको समझने में हेल्प कर सकते हैं एथिकल प्रिंसिपल्स. कैसे हेल्प कर सकते हैं? क्योंकि एथिकल प्रिंसिपल्स अपने आप में जूरिस्प्रूडेंस पर एक बहुत बड़ा प्रभाव डालते हैं. इस कॉन्टेक्स्ट में सौम्या ने हमें यूनाइटेड स्टेट्स सुप्रीम कोर्ट के 2 जजेस के बारे में बताया. यूनाइटेड स्टेट्स का सुप्रीम कोर्ट और उसका स्ट्रक्चर जो मैंने अभी समझाया, वो थोड़ा थोड़ा समझ में आया सबको?
यस सर.
तो वहां के बारे में बताया कि कैसे एक लिबरल जज है जस्टिस केनेडी और कैसे एक कंजर्वेटिव जज है जस्टिस स्कालिया. दोनों पढ़े लिखे हैं, दोनों अकॉम्प्लिश्ड हैं, दोनों अच्छे हैं, और कैसे वो डिफरेंट व्यूज उनके जो हैं, जो इशू ने भी कहा था कि उनके दोनों के अपने अलग व्यूज हैं, और जो डिफरेंट एथिकल स्कूल से वो दोनों आते हैं, वो कैसे अमेरिका में राइट्स किस फॉर्म में एग्जिस्ट करेंगे इस पर प्रभाव डालता है. तो जस्टिस केनेडी एक लिबरल जज है. जस्टिस केनेडी ने हमेशा सबको राइट्स दिए, स्विंग कर जाते थे वो इन फेवर ऑफ राइट्स, और इस तरीके से उन्होंने अपना वो रखा. और जो केस सौम्या ने भेजा ये सबको, ओबरगफेल्ड वर्सेस हॉजेस on right to marriage of LGBTQ citizens, उन्होंने कैसे इसको जो है अपना एक लीगल सैंक्टिटी दी, अपने एक एथिकल प्रिंसिपल को उन्होंने लीगल सैंक्टिटी दी। वेयर जस्टिस कलिया के एथिकल प्रिंसिपल्स थे कि नहीं, हमें ये सब नहीं करना चाहिए, जो उन्हीं राइट्स को प्रोटेक्ट करना चाहिए जो कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन में दी हुई हैं, चाहे वो 200 साल पुराना हो, चाहे उसका अमेंडमेंट बहुत मुश्किल हो, लेकिन हमें इससे आगे नहीं बढ़ना चाहिए। सो हमने ये पढ़ा है अबाउट एथिक्स, मतलब इस कॉन्टेक्स्ट में हम इस एग्जाम्पल को यूज कर सकते हैं। इज इट बेटर अंडरस्टूड, जूही?
Yes. Thank you.
Okay. So now we go further ahead from where we were yesterday, which is on natural law. Acha, before we go ahead with this, I hope you are aware that tomorrow also we will be having a class between 2 and 4.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Good. So going further ahead, we had read and discussed and debated Cicero. हम आगे बढ़ते हैं Aristotle and Thomasius पे. I'm reading from your reference notes so that you can follow. Okay. So Aristotle and Thomasius said, natural law is the unwritten law, jus non scriptum. It is also the universal or common law as being of universal validity. Jus non scriptum, as the term itself suggests to you, law without a script. Why do you think natural law is a law without a script? Why do you think natural law is just non scriptum? Anybody?
So because the source itself is not human. So
Very good.
Maybe that's why.
Yes, that is why. Source is not human. What do we call, what were some of the well understood channels of natural law? Sunlight, sun, and rain, and thunder, and fire, right? So this is a time, as we had discussed yesterday, of barbarism, of no regard for human command or human life or the concept of sovereign not having authority by itself, but by a fear of the Almighty that existed in these different kinds of modes and mediums of natural law. So that is why nobody can write it down, is what they were trying to say. And then slowly, as you will see, this system evolved into the system of political sovereign, in as much as there were then certain people who were almost chosen for the purpose of any kind of expression of this natural law. That is where the king derived his authority. The king was referred to as the deputy of the god. That is why kings and nobility and noble blood started becoming important. Okay, so this is Aristotle and Thomasius' definition. It is the unwritten law. It is also the universal or common law as being of universal validity. So if you see, the word universal is coming very often, right? So it means that it goes without saying that it applies on everyone, whether you are a subject of it, whether you agree to its application or not. Okay. Then I'm reading the definition of Hooks. Hooks says, natural law is the eternal law, as having existed from the commencement of the world, uncreated and immutable. Does anybody have anything to say on these two definitions as offered by Aristotle and Thomasius and Hooks? Okay. So we go ahead. Let's try and memorize some of the essential categories of natural law, right? Some, just like we did with the sections 9, 10, 11, 12 provisions of the Civil Procedure Code. I hope all of you have done the specific case laws you had to do. In case you haven't, please do it today. I might remind you tomorrow because the Saturday, Sunday classes for them are going to be important, because I want the case law discussion to take place, and then we will be going on further topics. So just as we did with the Bare Act of CPC, let's try to do it with different things of natural law. This has also been done in your course material that has been provided to you. So natural law includes divine law, law of reason. Divine law is one, law of reason is the other. Why is natural law being called the law of reason if it's divine? Should we expect rationality in natural law? Anybody? Does anybody want me to explain why is natural law being called the law of reason?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Now, I'm sure you would have heard in some typical Hindi movies that भगवान ने किया है तो अच्छा ही किया होगा. None of you have heard.
Yes, sir.
Yes,
So
sir.
it comes from that school of thought that, you know, if God has willed it, therefore it is good. So that is why this concept of divine law is overbearing in every single tenet of natural law. So when we say it's a law of reason, it means that because it is the divine law, it is willed by the God, that is why it is the law of reason. Is it understood?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Okay. So divine law, law of reason, unwritten law, universal or common law, eternal law. You understand the difference between all these things? Universal or common law, it applies to everyone. Then we're saying eternal law. You understand why is it being called eternal? It will continue for ages and ages, even beyond individuals. And then principles of morality. So these are some of the 6 ingredients of natural law. So if you've got to write about natural law as a school of jurisprudence, you can, these are the 6 things that you should write in your answer. Then we come to the basic tenets of natural law school, which we've just discussed above. We have to also look at this one term that is used in the basic tenets of natural law, which is called a priori. Can any one of you explain this? What is the meaning of a priori? I'm referring to your reference material. It says rules of law can be studied on the basis of a priori method. That is to, okay, I will not go ahead. Can anyone explain what is the meaning of a priori? You want to explain, Monica?
Okay, sir. Sir, so it means that the deductions or anything that we infer, so it more or less has a theoretical basis to it. So there is no empirical study being done or experiment performed in order to reach to a certain conclusion.
Very true. So why do you think natural law can be categorized as a priori?
Sir, because we've had this notion that there is a divine path, and who the source or channel of law is driving or flowing from that divine path. So I think we not reflected upon the fact that this is man-made, or we mold law or deduct something from it after doing certain experiment that is to responding to the need of society, like we do today. The legislation that we have is a result of what like the society needs us to come up with law. So maybe.
Am I audible?
Yes, sir.
Yes,
I'm
sir.
very sorry. I don't know what happened. I just got logged out automatically. Okay. And then I had a hard way finding myself back. I'm sorry. Okay. So, what were we discussing? A priori, right? Or this is what we were discussing, right?
Yes, sir.
So I had asked Monica to tell us what it was. She had just completed telling us what it was, and after that, I wanted to. Some of you there were many people who missed yesterday's class, right? You were there. You also missed, I think, Monica. Were you able to
Yes,
follow
sir.
it through the recorded lecture?
No, sir, I've not seen the recorded lecture as of yet, but I will complete it today.
Okay. Those of you who have missed it, please do so. Otherwise, you might just miss understanding the very basics of natural law and how we've proceeded further. So, a priori, as she explained, is essentially, you can write it down, to accept a thing without an inquiry or observation, which is that you accept something at face value. You don't inquire or observe or apply any other logical method of deduction. So as we've already discussed, since most of natural law, in fact, all of natural law, flows from these eternal divine concepts. So can you go and question the sun god? Can you go and question fire or light? Unless, You are watching Clash of the Titans or something like that. Hollywood movies where you question these gods. You can't question them. And that is why their rule of law is a priori. It is not something which is open to inquiry or observation. Does it make sense?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so everybody is clear with what is a priori?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
Okay. So I am now moving ahead with brief history of natural law school. What is the history of natural law school? So Friedman is one noted scholar of that time who has been quoted as to explain that it is a tale of the search of mankind for absolute justice and its failure. Natural law always emerged as an idea that is above the positive law. Now, we will be coming to positive law in the analytical school tomorrow. I will be finishing that topic in entirety tomorrow itself in the 2 hours we have. But to just tell you in short, positive law is much inspired by what we read about Austin or even Bentham, right? Which is that it is written largely. It is based on the command of the sovereign, etc., etc., which is very different from natural law. So Friedman here is trying to tell us. So I'm just giving you a brief idea about positive law before we get to it, so that you can understand it in the context of what Friedman is saying about natural law. Friedman is saying that natural law emerged as an idea that is above the positive law. Even in our judicial systems, if again let's go back to Hindi movies, when the hero gets punished and he's being sentenced inappropriately, doesn't he say that मेरी अदालत तो ऊपर वाला है, as in the God is my ultimate jurist and he will decide whether I am guilty or not. So or let's take even a better example. I'm sure you would know that before you give a testimony, you do it on oath. When you file a writ petition, you do it on oath. And you write, help me God, unless you're an atheist, then alternative arrangements are made. But all these things still continue to invoke natural law. Don't you think so? So natural law, even in today's ultra-modern judicial system of these times of video conferencing and all, still holds some kind of sway in our judicial system. Have you read some of these affidavits? The last page says, help me God. Have you seen it? Any one of you?
No, sir.
Yes, sir.
Okay. So when you will see that it says help me God. At least you would have read you would have seen some of the Hindi movies where they say मैं गीता पे कसम खाता हूँ कि मैं सच कहूँगा और सच के सिवा कुछ नहीं कहूँगा. Have you seen that somewhere?
Yes, sir.
You have, right? So these are again all ways and means in which natural law still continues to hold relevance in our modern judicial system. However, so I'm going back to what Friedman was saying. However, one aspect that appears to be permanent is the appearance of nature as an ideal higher than that of positive law. So Friedman is trying to pit natural law as against positive law to tell us that natural law will always have the upper hand over positive law. So this is what Friedman was trying to say in the context of Friedman becomes a relevant author in the context of natural law and positive law to be evaluated together from the same lens. Anybody has any question on what Friedman has said? So we go ahead. Natural law has helped in the development of the civil law of the Romans. It also contributed a lot in the development of international law. It also fought totalitarianism and absolutism. Does anybody know the meaning of totalitarianism?
It's dictatorship.
Could you explain a little more? What kind of dictatorship? By whom? What is a totalitarian state?
So like Nazis, like
So how
Hitler.
So how can natural law help us against the Nazis and Hitler and their likes?
Sir, I feel in a way because when we talk about natural law, we see the presence of reason, and we also say that it has divine origin. So, if it has divine origin, then there has to be some prudence or reason involved therein. So, basically, people know like what is good and what is not. So, there is this chain of we can say basic human attributes which we also expect out of like people or government per se. So the people who are there in government, they also will have certain sort of morality in themselves, and the subjects will also, they know what is right, so they'll respond to their governments if the government is found to be arbitrary or
Okay. Uh, can anyone explain to me in the terms of what we discussed yesterday about natural law? How can natural law help us against a dictator? I'm looking for a specific answer. Yes, Sukriti, go ahead.
So since we are the natural law jurists are presupposing certain laws that are universally applicable. So in a totalitarian regime, there is no self assertion. There can be no opposition. So it basically cancels out the belief of natural law that everybody has certain pre-existing presupposed rights and laws.
Okay, so I will tell you what was the answer I was looking for. I explained yesterday, and that's why it becomes very important to those of you who've missed the class to go back to yesterday's class and watch it. That law in general is about power, right? It is about holding that power. It is about executing that power. It is about commanding that power. Therefore, fear element is also an important element of law, as we discussed yesterday. Now, who is someone who's in charge of a totalitarian state? An example was given of the Nazis, right? Somebody who is himself fundamentally tyrannical. Now, who becomes a tyrant? Who becomes a totalitarian governor? Can anyone with low sense of self-esteem become a tyrant? No, they are always overtly confident about themselves. They think of them as God, right? They are all power wielding, everything doing strongman image. They are the kind of people who become dictators. Now, to such people who are not afraid of any other human, what is the single thing that can probably scare them? Natural law. This knowledge that you are second in this world and will always be second to some kind of a divine force. And that is why natural law also helped in fighting totalitarianism and absolutism. Does it make sense?
Yes, sir.
yes, sir.
Okay. So, friends, one advice from my side will be that try to link different concepts you study and try to apply them. Like this kind of an answer should have come to you, to some of you. I hope it was coming to some of you, because only then is there a purpose of these classes. If you learn new ideas, new ways of looking at things, apply them. Okay. So then we are now coming to the history of natural law. How can we trace the history of natural law? We're dealing with Greece, the Roman Empire, the Christian period, as well as India. So all of you have the reference material. Would anybody want to read from Greece onwards? Anybody?
So this module has not been added.
Okay, so I will read. Very good. Greece. The Greeks are said to have laid the foundations of the natural law school. Heraclitus observed a certain rhythm in events and termed it as destiny, order, and reason of the world. With this, he laid down the basis of natural law. The Greeks considered nature to be a certain order of things, and those order of things ultimately resulted in the formation of law. in the 5th century BC, it also formed a major part of philosophical thinking. So, what can we understand about the Greeks? That they have helped form the foundations of natural law, and nature for the Greeks was all important, right? So, it reflects from their understanding of natural law, and they've used an interesting word called destiny. As in, destiny, order, and reason of the world are the important tools of natural law. Okay, is it clear? Does anybody have any questions about Greece? With regard to any specific questions about the text, you will have access to the text sooner than later, so you can refer to it from there. But any questions about Greece?
Yes, sir. Could you please maybe, reflect on the first half of the definition which Greeks gave, or the
So the Greeks have not given a definition. We are now dealing with the history of natural law school, and we are trying to find out in different civilizations in different countries how was natural law perceived. So in the context of Greeks, the first half of what I've read out laid down that they laid the foundations of the natural law school, and they observed a kind of a destiny, order, and reason of the world, and traced it back to nature, right? So this is what is sui generis to the Greeks. Do you understand the meaning of the term sui generis?
Yes, sir.
What does it mean?
One of a kind.
Yes, unique. So they've added this concept of destiny. Okay. Can you explain to me a concept which is sui generis to the Indian civilization as drawn from natural law, which continues to hold wide application, if not in the judicial space, but in general society, not just in India, but world over? Can you explain to me one Indian natural law concept that is very, very popular everywhere? Anybody?
so the concept of dharma?
Okay. Dharma, yes, if someone is very learned. But if someone is not very learned, then what is that Indian concept of natural law which is very popular? Let me give you a hint.
Sir, oath before the proceedings.
Oath before the proceedings. तो मुस्कान, हाँ ठीक है, हेल्प मी गॉड का कॉन्सेप्ट लेकिन और कंट्रीज में भी है, तो मैं एक हिंट ड्रॉप कर रहा हूं. And the person who, this is a fun exercise also, you've got to unmute your mic and I need to see who gives me the first answer, because everybody will know and I really want to see who's the sharpest among you all. So I am going to give you that hint. Is everybody ready?
Yes, sir.
Okay. I want to see who's giving me the answer first. So the hint is your dash comes back to you.
Karma.
Who said it first? I don't know. It came from everyone. Yes. So this entire cycle of karma, karma being an expletive word, and how what you do comes back to you. So this is again an Indian concept of natural law, which finds a lot of application even in the Western world. They know this term and they use it very often, right? So when you talk about natural law, even if you don't remember dharma, you should remember karma. Okay? So we'll come to the Indian approach in a little while, but we were discussing Greeks. So any question on the Greeks?
No, sir.
Okay. So now we come to the Romans.
So I had a specific question.
Yes, Ishu, go ahead.
Sir?
Yes. Yes, Ishu, go ahead, please.
I cannot. So basically, I just want to know that we all started in history with a natural power. We started worshiping the divine. So how it come in a later stages? They connect something to a people or a human, as in source of that particular thing. As we started worshipping the things as a natural form, in a natural form, so with the pace of the time coming to right now, we are living in that civilization, that people used to worship a god, a deity, make a a statue of him and going to worship of that, or maybe some kind of karma you are saying that, how they connect karma to this, all the things. Maybe this is not a part of a subject, but I'm very curious to know about this thing.
Okay. So it's a very good and valid question. See, look at something. Humans started as a hunter-gatherer society. We were very barbaric. There was not much difference between, the monkeys you see on the tree and probably the 40th ancestor you might have had from where you are today, the 40th person up there, or the 100th person up there, if there was any. So from there, we evolved into a civilized society that involved dialogue between two persons, scientific advance such as discovery of fire, and then this understanding that rain will come, so we will get wet, let's go to a shade. If there's no shade, we need to make shade. If you heat food, it becomes tasty. If you just kill a rabbit and eat it, it's not that tasty. If you heat its meat, it's tasty. Small things led to greater and greater discovery. Now, once we are in the natural law school environment, where we know there are larger forces at work, then what happened was humans also started simultaneously realizing that here are we humans who are gifted. We can appreciate the natural beauty, and therefore we too are very special. We are as special as the sun. We are as special as the fire, because we are able to appreciate it. We are able to harness it. We are able to mold it. We are able to use it for our own gain. And that is why these things were given human shapes and human deities and were worshipped in human form across civilizations. It is not just, in India where you have Indradev standing with the Vajra and trying to throw the Vajra at the Govardhan Parvat. No, even, some of these very interesting movies on angels versus demons and the clash of the titans I've already referred to, and the entire concept of Zeus being the ultimate god. So that is how this change happened, Ishu. As we transformed and advanced and realized our own capabilities, we kept it second only to these natural forces. And we realized that since both are special, let's mingle the two. Since humans are the ultimate special race, therefore we need to have, they need to have human form. And see, somewhere in the context of the Indian civilization, say Lord Hanuman or Lord Ganesha, there was a consistent blend between natural law and the understanding of even animals. Even in the Roman civilization, even among the Greeks, they had the concept of a unicorn, or the concept of what is called a Pegasus, different kinds of instruments of unique animals. So our creativity is also spanned across just the forces of nature to our own uniqueness. That is how the deity form came about. Does it make some sense?
So I can say that person mold the things in a way he likes, or someone likes.
Yes. In the way where it can be understood to everyone. So if it's night and I want to worship the sun god, it's easier for me to imagine. Okay, this is a deity of the sun god that I've drawn. The sun god is full of light, so I need a face which radiates light.
All right, understood. Thank you.
Okay. So yes, Monica.
Sir, I do have a question with this concept. So, sir, can we just then say that the representative form of government which we have now, so it has its roots in this very concept that like king or the rulers were the representative or messengers of God. So, keeping the same line, can we just, in order to like make our representatives more accountable, can we in any way make this argument that since we had this entire the conception of rulers being the representative of God, therefore they need to be accountable or have a certain sort of righteousness in themselves. So if they do any act which is inhuman or which is not like listening to their subjects or to their people, so therefore they should be accountable.
Okay, that's an interesting question. See, I will still say natural law instruments hold deep sway in the public, in general public, in some practices of law also. However, if we were to say that natural law determines how governments function in modern democracies, that will not be entirely correct. Let me give you an example. True that oaths are taken even today. The concept of taking an oath of secrecy, and all of these things, it is essentially coming from natural law because it's essentially moralistic, right? But let's look at things with greater detail. Let's not have an ex facie reading of things. Ex facie means on the face of it. Let's not have a prima facie look of things. What is the oath of secrecy or the oath taken to? If you look at some of these oaths, they say, I will discharge my duty, I will be very, very sincere to the Constitution. Now, the Constitution is not a natural law instrument. The Constitution is very much a positive law instrument. It has been made by humans.
Yes,
Right?
sir.
But the concept of oath is there, which you can draw from natural law. Because the concept of oath does not come directly from positive law. The Constitution does not say somewhere that take my oath. Of course, it says that oath has to be taken, but the Constitution does not say that my oath has to be taken by everyone. Does it say somewhere? No, it doesn't. So that is why it will be too far. It will be going too far, and in my view, it will be inaccurate to say that natural law determines how governments run today. But yes, natural law still exists with some kind of imprints, even in the most modern judicial systems of the world, not just India. Does that make some sense?
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Okay, so I think we should conclude with this. I will be reading the we will be discussing Roman Empire and Christian period tomorrow. Tomorrow we will try to finish both natural law as well as positive law. But keep the questions going. That is how we can make all these things interesting. If you have crazy ideas in your mind, please don't have any fear of any kind to test it here. Right? So discuss with your open minds and open hearts. Okay. So that's all from my side. Okay. See you tomorrow at 2 p.m. Bye.
Nice,
Thank
sir.
you, sir.